Listen, we've all met that person at work, right? You know the type. The one who judges people based on what they're wearing, what car they pull up in, or how confidently they speak in meetings. The manager who thinks they've got everyone figured out in the first 30 seconds. Well, this is a story about one of those managers, a woman so consumed by her own sense of importance that she couldn't see past the designer glasses. And it's about a quiet single dad who showed up to work every day in worn jeans and faded shirts, kept his head down, and never made a fuss. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this unassuming man with callous hands and tired eyes was hiding something that would eventually turn their entire world upside down. Before you continue with this story, do me a favor. Hit that like button, smash that subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this plays out. Ethan Parker had been working at Riverside Manufacturing for about 8 months when this story really begins. He showed up on his first day in a 15-year-old Honda Civic that sputtered in the parking lot, wearing jeans that had seen better days and a simple gray t-shirt under a worn jacket. He was assigned to the production floor, manual labor mostly, and he never complained. Not once. He clocked in at 7 in the morning, worked through his shift with quiet efficiency, and left at 3:30 to pick up his daughter from school. Everyone who worked alongside Ethan liked him well enough. He wasn't much for small talk, but he was reliable, always willing to help when someone needed an extra hand, and he had this gentle way about him that made people feel at ease. His daughter Olivia was 7 years old, and if you asked anyone who'd seen them together in the parking lot during pickup time, they'd tell you that little girl was his entire world. Ethan's wife had passed away 2 years earlier, cancer, and he'd been raising Olivia on his own ever since. The grief was still there in his eyes if you looked close enough, that particular kind of sadness that never fully goes away. But he carried it quietly, the same way he seemed to carry everything else in his life. Now, the manager in this story, her name was Veronica Chambers, and she ran the operations department at Riverside like it was her personal kingdom. Veronica was in her early 40s, always impeccably dressed in designer suits, her hair styled perfectly, nails manicured, everything about her screaming success and status. She'd worked her way up at Riverside over 12 years, and she wasn't shy about reminding people of that fact. Veronica had a particular way of looking at production floor workers, this expression that somehow managed to be both dismissive and pitying at the same time. She rarely learned their names unless she absolutely had to, referred to them mostly as numbers or positions, and made it clear through 1,000 small gestures that she considered herself several levels above them in every way that mattered. When Veronica first noticed Ethan, it was only because he'd made a mistake on a production report. She called him into her office, and he'd stood there in his work clothes, oil stain on his sleeve, while she sat behind her massive desk in her expensive chair and lectured him about attention to detail. She barely looked at him while she spoke, mostly focused on her computer screen, typing away at emails, treating him like he was an inconvenience she had to manage between more important tasks. Ethan apologized quietly, said it wouldn't happen again, and left. Veronica forgot about him almost immediately. He was just another floor worker, another nameless, faceless person doing manual labor, nobody worth her time or attention. But here's the thing about Veronica's management style. She didn't just ignore people like Ethan because she was busy. She actively looked down on them. During management meetings, she'd make comments about the production floor staff, questioning their intelligence, their work ethic, their capability. She'd fought against every proposal for better break room facilities, saying they should be grateful to have jobs at all. When HR suggested more comprehensive benefits for hourly workers, Veronica was the loudest voice opposing it, arguing it would set a bad precedent. She believed in a strict hierarchy, and in her mind, people like Ethan were at the bottom of that hierarchy for a reason. They lacked ambition, education, drive. They were there to do simple tasks and nothing more. The other managers had mixed feelings about Veronica. Some admired her efficiency and her results. She did run a tight ship and production numbers were solid. Others found her attitude off-putting but didn't want to rock the boat. The CEO, Harold Brennan, whose grandfather had founded the company, rarely involved himself in day-to-day operations anymore, so Veronica had a lot of autonomy. She used that autonomy to run things exactly as she saw fit, and how she saw fit was with an iron fist and very little empathy. Ethan never complained about Veronica, not to his co-workers, not to anyone. When guys on the floor would gripe about her during lunch breaks, about how she denied some request or made some dismissive comment, Ethan would just listen quietly, eat his sandwich, and go back to work. He had his daughter to think about, bills to pay, and he couldn't afford to make waves. This job had good enough pay, and the hours allowed him to be there for Olivia when she needed him. That was what mattered. His pride, his ego, none of that was important compared to making sure his little girl had what she needed. But Veronica's treatment of Ethan specifically got worse over time. Maybe it was because he was so quiet, so unresponsive to her provocations. Maybe it was because he never showed any reaction when she was condescending, never gave her the satisfaction of looking bothered. Whatever the reason, she seemed to single him out more and more. She'd assign him the worst tasks, the dirtiest jobs, the ones nobody wanted. She'd criticize his work in front of others even when he'd done nothing wrong. She'd schedule him for overtime, then cancel it at the last minute, messing with his ability to arrange childcare. Small cruelties, the kind that are hard to prove but impossible to ignore when you're on the receiving end. One afternoon, about 10 months into Ethan working at Riverside, Veronica was giving a tour to some potential investors. She was in full performance mode, showing off a facility, talking about efficiency and productivity, gesturing expansively at the production floor like she'd built every machine with her own hands. Ethan was working on repairing a conveyor belt, his hands covered in grease, completely focused on the task. Veronica's group walked by, and one of the investors asked about worker retention and satisfaction. Veronica launched into a prepared speech about how they valued all their employees, how everyone at Riverside was part of a family, all the usual corporate language that sounded good but meant nothing. Right as she was saying this, Ethan stood up from where he'd been crouching, wiping his hands on a rag, and accidentally made eye contact with Veronica. She paused mid-sentence, and in that pause, something flickered across her face. Annoyance, maybe, or discomfort at having to reconcile her polished words with the reality of this tired-looking man in dainty clothes standing 10 feet away. She recovered quickly, steering the group away. But Ethan had seen it. That look, the one that said he didn't fit the narrative she was selling. He went back to work. Olivia was Ethan's reason for everything, but she was also his challenge. Raising a daughter alone, trying to be both parents, trying to fill the gap left by her mother, it was the hardest thing he'd ever done. He helped her with homework every night at their small kitchen table. He braided her hair in the mornings, getting better at it slowly, though it never looked quite as good as when his wife had done it. He packed her lunches, went to every parent-teacher conference, sat through every school play and recital. Money was tight, always tight, but he made it work. Olivia didn't have the fanciest clothes or the newest toys, but she had a father who showed up, who was present, who loved her with everything he had. The other single parents at Olivia's school, mostly moms, had adopted Ethan into their circle. They'd share tips with him, invite him and Olivia over for play dates, help out when his work schedule got complicated. Ethan was grateful for them in ways he couldn't quite express. He wasn't great with words, never had been, but he tried to show his appreciation by helping them out whenever he could. Fixed a broken fence for one neighbor, helped another move furniture, small things that he could do with his hands since talking about feelings didn't come naturally. At work, Ethan had made one real friend, an older guy named Walter who'd been at Riverside for 25 years. Walter was a mechanic in the maintenance department, and he'd taken a liking to Ethan early on. They'd eat lunch together sometimes, and Walter would talk about his grandkids while Ethan would listen and occasionally share stories about Olivia. Walter had been around long enough to see managers like Veronica come and go, and he had a philosophical attitude about it all. He'd tell Ethan not to let her get to him, that people like that eventually showed their true colors, that karma had a way of working things out. Ethan appreciated the sentiment even if he didn't quite believe it. Things came to a head on a Wednesday in March. The company were preparing for a major safety inspection, one of those official visits that could result in fines or sanctions if things weren't up to code. Veronica was stressed, which meant everyone under her was stressed, which meant the production floor was a pressure cooker of tension. She'd been micromanaging every detail, snapping at people, finding fault with everything. Ethan had been assigned to help clean and organize one of the storage areas, making sure everything was properly labeled and positioned. He'd been at it for hours, methodical and thorough the way he approached everything, and he was nearly finished when Veronica came storming through with her clipboard. She started finding problems immediately, or what she decided were problems. This wasn't organized right, that wasn't labeled clearly enough. Everything he'd done was wrong according to her. Ethan tried to explain his reasoning, that he'd followed the safety guidelines exactly as they were written, but Veronica wasn't interested in explanations. She was interested in having someone to blame for her stress, someone to take it out on. The criticism escalated, her voice getting louder, attracting attention from other workers. She questioned his competence, his intelligence, his ability to follow simple instructions. And Ethan just stood there and took it, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past his shoulder, waiting for it to be over. But then Veronica made a mistake. She brought Olivia into it. She said something about how if this was the best effort he could manage, no wonder he was working a job like this. And maybe that's why he was raising his daughter alone in whatever rundown situation they were probably living in, because he clearly couldn't handle anything requiring actual skill or intelligence. The words came out sharp and mean, designed to cut deep, and they did. Several workers who'd been pretending not to watch were now staring openly, shocked that she'd gone that far. Walter, who'd been passing by, actually stopped and looked like he was considering intervening. Ethan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. His face went carefully blank in that way it did when he was fighting to control his emotions. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, and you could feel the tension in the air, everyone waiting to see what would happen. Then Ethan took a slow breath, unclenched his fists, and said in a quiet, steady voice that he'd redo the storage area however she wanted it done, and it would be ready before the inspection. Veronica looked almost disappointed that she hadn't gotten more reaction, but she nodded curtly, made a note on her clipboard, and walked away, her heels clicking on the concrete floor. Walter came over after Veronica was gone, and put a hand on Ethan's shoulder, asked if he was okay. Ethan nodded, said he was fine, and got back to work. But he wasn't fine, not really. It was one thing for Veronica to disrespect him, to treat him like he was beneath her. That was just about ego and office politics, and he could handle that. But bringing his daughter into it, making assumptions about Olivia's life, that crossed a line. For the first time since he'd started at Riverside, Ethan went home that night and seriously considered quitting. But then Olivia ran to hug him when he walked in the door, chattering about her day at school, and he remembered why he endured it all. He'd find another job eventually, something better. But for now, he needed the steady paycheck and the schedule that let him be the father Olivia needed. What nobody at Riverside knew, what Ethan had never mentioned to anyone except maybe Walter in the vaguest terms, was who he'd been before his wife died, before Olivia became his priority, before he'd deliberately chosen a simple job that wouldn't consume his life. Ethan had a doctorate in engineering from MIT. He'd spent 8 years working in aerospace design, had 3 patents to his name, had been on track to become one of the youngest senior engineers at a major corporation. His work had been his passion, his identity, and he'd been good at it, brilliant even. But then Rebecca got sick, and everything else stopped mattering. He'd taken leave to care for her, And when she passed, he'd been left with a grief so profound he could barely function and a young daughter who'd just lost a mother. The high-powered engineering job had required travel, long hours, constant availability, and Ethan knew he couldn't do that and be the parent Olivia needed. So he'd made a choice. He'd stepped away from that career, from that identity, and he'd looked for something simple, something that wouldn't follow him home, something that paid enough to get by and had reasonable hours. Riverside had been hiring. They didn't ask complicated questions, and the shift timing was perfect. He'd left his entire previous life off his resume, listed only the basic qualifications needed for production work, and nobody had looked any deeper. Why would they? He was just another guy looking for an hourly job. Ethan had made peace with this decision because it wasn't really a sacrifice in his mind. Olivia mattered more than career advancement or professional recognition or any of that. But he was still the same person he'd always been, with the same mind, the same skills, the same knowledge. He just wasn't using them in any official capacity. He noticed things around Riverside, inefficiencies in the production processes, safety issues that others overlooked, equipment that was being used incorrectly or could be optimized. He'd occasionally mention something to Walter, casually, never making a big deal of it. Walter would pass it along to the right people, and things would get fixed. Nobody ever questioned where the insights came from. Walter was experienced enough that people just assumed he'd figured it out himself. The safety inspection was scheduled for Friday, and by Thursday afternoon, Veronica was in rare form. She'd been stalking around the facility for days, terrorizing everyone, convinced that something would go wrong and she'd be held responsible. The irony was that most of the actual safety issues at Riverside existed because of decisions she'd made, cutting corners to save money, deferring maintenance to meet budget targets, ignoring recommendations from the safety committee because implementing them would be inconvenient. But Veronica had a talent for deflecting blame, and she'd already identified several scapegoats if things went south, Ethan among them. Thursday evening, after most people had gone home, Ethan was doing a final walkthrough of his area, making absolutely sure everything was perfect, not giving Veronica any ammunition. That's when he noticed something wrong with one of the main hydraulic systems. There was a leak, small but steady, and the pressure gauge was reading higher than it should. Ethan crouched down to get a better look, and his blood went cold. The safety valve had been installed incorrectly, probably during a repair job months ago, and it wasn't going to release pressure the way it was supposed to. The system was operating fine under normal conditions, but if there was a surge, which could happen randomly or during the inspection when they'd be running demonstrations, the valve wouldn't vent properly. Best case scenario, the machine would shut down. Worst case, the hydraulic line could rupture, sending high-pressure fluid spraying everywhere, which could cause serious injury to anyone nearby. Ethan checked the inspection schedule posted on the wall. The hydraulic systems demonstration was literally the first thing on the agenda for tomorrow morning. They'd have the inspectors standing right there when they powered it up to full capacity. He looked at his watch. It was almost 6. The maintenance supervisor had already left. Veronica would still be in her office, but the thought of going to her with this made him hesitate. Still, this wasn't about pride or past grievances. This was about safety, about people potentially getting hurt. Ethan walked to Veronica's office. Her door was open, and she was on her phone, laughing at something. Her work persona dropped now that the audience was gone. Ethan knocked lightly on the doorframe. Veronica looked up, and her expression immediately shifted to annoyance. She held up a finger, making him wait while she finished a conversation, which went on for another 3 minutes while Ethan stood there. Finally, she ended the call and looked at him with barely concealed impatience, asking what he wanted in a tone that made it clear she didn't actually want to know. Ethan explained what he'd found: the faulty valve, the pressure issue, the potential danger during tomorrow's demonstration. He kept it simple and factual, expecting she'd immediately call someone, escalate it, get it handled. Instead, Veronica stared at him for a moment, then asked how he knew anything about hydraulic systems. Ethan said he'd noticed a pressure gauge and checked it out, that it was pretty obvious once you looked. Veronica's eyes narrowed. She asked if he was trying to sabotage the inspection, if this was some kind of revenge for her being hard on him. Ethan was so taken aback by the accusation that he couldn't respond for a second. He gathered himself and said no. He was trying to prevent an accident, that she could have anyone she wanted verify what he was saying, but someone needed to check it before tomorrow. Veronica stood up from her desk, came around to where Ethan was standing, and looked him up and down with that particular expression he'd seen so many times, the one that said she'd already decided he was wasting her time. She told him that the hydraulic system had been inspected by certified technicians just last month, that everything was fine, and she wasn't going to create a panic or delay the inspection because someone who pushed boxes around for a living thought he noticed something. Ethan tried again, said he understood how it sounded, but this was serious. People could get hurt. Veronica cut him off, said she didn't need a floor worker telling her how to do her job, and suggested he go home and let the actual professionals handle things. She'd already turned back to her desk, dismissing him completely. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, trying to figure out what to do. He could go over her head. But to who? The other managers had all left, and Veronica had made it clear she wasn't going to back him up. If he made a fuss and turned out to be wrong, he'd probably be fired. But he wasn't wrong. He knew he wasn't wrong. He thought about Olivia, about needing this job, about how complicated his life would become if he lost it. And then he thought about someone getting seriously injured tomorrow because he didn't push harder. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Ethan left Veronica's office and went back to the production floor. He found the main power junction for that section and shut down the hydraulic system entirely. He locked it out using the safety protocol, attaching a tag that said the system was under maintenance and not to be operated. It would cause problems in the morning when they went to do the demonstration, but at least nobody would get hurt. Then he went home, pretty sure he'd just ended his employment at Riverside, but knowing he'd done the right thing. The next morning, Ethan came in early, before his usual shift, figuring he'd better be there to explain himself when everything hit the fan. He was right. Veronica found him within 10 minutes of arriving, and she was furious. She demanded to know why the hydraulic system was locked out, who had authorized it, what the hell he thought he was doing. Ethan explained again about the faulty valve, said he'd shut it down because she wouldn't listen last night, because it wasn't safe to operate. Other people were starting to gather, including some of the other managers and a few of the morning shift workers. Veronica was practically shouting now, saying he had no authority to shut down equipment, that he'd sabotaged the inspection, that he was fired effective immediately. That's when Walter showed up with a maintenance supervisor, a guy named Craig who'd come in early when he heard about the shutdown. Craig asked what was going on, and Ethan explained for the third time about the valve and the pressure issue. Craig looked at Veronica, then at Ethan, then said he'd go check it out. Veronica said it was fine, that it had been inspected, but Craig was already walking toward the system, and several people followed him, curious now. Ethan stayed where he was, with Veronica glaring at him, waiting. It took Craig about 5 minutes. He came back looking grim, with Walter beside him. Craig said Ethan was right. The safety valve had been cross-threaded during installation. It wasn't seated properly, and at full pressure it would have failed. If they'd run the demonstration as planned, the hydraulic line would have ruptured. Craig said people could have been seriously hurt, potentially killed if someone was standing in the wrong place. The group that had gathered went quiet. Veronica's face went white, then red. She started to say something about how the system had been inspected, how this wasn't her fault. But Craig cut her off, said there was going to be an incident report and an investigation into how this got missed. The inspectors arrived about 20 minutes later, and instead of starting with a hydraulic demonstration, they started with an emergency examination of what had almost been a catastrophic safety failure. The CEO, Harold Brennan, who'd planned to make a brief appearance to shake hands, ended up staying for the whole thing once he heard what happened. Veronica tried to control the narrative, but too many people had witnessed a confrontation that morning, and word spread fast. By lunchtime, everyone in the facility knew that Ethan had identified a serious safety issue, that Veronica had ignored him and accused him of sabotaging the inspection, and that if he hadn't shut down the system anyway, people might have died. Harold Brennan asked to speak with Ethan privately that afternoon. They went to a conference room, and Harold, who was in his 60s and had a reputation as a straight shooter, asked Ethan to walk him through everything that had happened. Ethan did, simply and without editorializing. Harold listened, asked some questions, then asked the one that changed everything. He wanted to know how someone working on the production floor had the knowledge to identify a complex hydraulic safety issue that had been missed by certified technicians. Ethan hesitated, and Harold said, "Off the record, just between us, who are you?" So Ethan told him. Not everything, but enough. The engineering background, the aerospace work, the patents, MIT, the whole thing. Harold listened without interrupting, and when Ethan finished, Harold asked the obvious question. Why was someone with that background working an entry-level job at a manufacturing plant? Ethan explained about Rebecca, about Olivia, about needing to be present as a father, about choosing a simple job deliberately so he could focus on his daughter. Harold was quiet for a long moment, then asked if Ethan had any interest in using his actual skills again, maybe in a capacity that would still allow him to be there for his daughter. Ethan said he'd think about it, but honestly, he wasn't sure. He'd built a life that worked, and even if it wasn't glamorous, it was stable, and Olivia was thriving. Harold nodded, said he understood, but that Riverside could use someone like Ethan, someone who actually knew what they were doing and gave a damn about safety and doing things right. He said to take some time, think about it, and they'd talk again. Then Harold said that regardless of what Ethan decided about his future, he wanted to thank him for yesterday, that he prevented what could have been a tragedy, and that took courage, especially given the circumstances. The investigation into the safety failure took about a week. It turned out the faulty valve installation was just one of several issues that got uncovered once people started looking closely. Maintenance had been deferred, reports had been filed and ignored, safety recommendations had been overruled, and a lot of it traced back to decisions Veronica had made or approved. She was suspended pending the full investigation, and eventually she was let go, not just for the safety issues, but because once HR started digging, they found a pattern of behavior, complaints that had been filed and somehow buried, documentation of her treatment of subordinates, all the things that had been tolerated or overlooked for years because her production numbers were good. Ethan didn't take any pleasure in Veronica losing her job. Honestly, he felt a little bad about it, even though she treated him terribly and put people at risk. He wasn't vindictive by nature, and he knew she probably had her own pressures, her own struggles, her own reasons for being the way she was. But he also knew that organizations needed leaders who valued people's safety and dignity over their own ego and comfort, and Veronica hadn't been that kind of leader. The story of what happened spread beyond Riverside. Local news picked it up, the angle of a humble worker preventing a disaster, and while Ethan refused to do interviews, his name got out there. That's how his former colleagues from the aerospace industry found out where he'd ended up. He started getting calls and emails, people he hadn't talked to in years, asking if he was okay, if he needed anything, saying they'd heard what happened and they were proud of him. It was overwhelming and a little embarrassing, and Ethan mostly didn't return the messages. That life felt like a different person, someone he'd been a long time ago. Harold Brennan made Ethan an offer about 3 weeks after everything went down. A position in the engineering department, officially titled Safety and Operations Consultant, with the understanding that Ethan would have autonomy over his schedule and the flexibility to be there for Olivia. The pay was substantially more than what he'd been making on the production floor, though still less than what he could command elsewhere. But that wasn't the point. Harold said he wanted to rebuild the culture at Riverside, actually mean it when they said they valued safety in people, and he needed someone who understood the work from the ground up and had the expertise to make real changes. He said Ethan had proven he was that person. Ethan talked to Olivia about it. She was only 7, but he'd always tried to include her in big decisions in age-appropriate ways. He explained that Daddy might take a different job at the same place, that it would mean sometimes working on computers and in meetings instead of fixing machines, but that he'd still be able to pick her up from school and be home for dinner. Olivia asked if it would make him happy, and Ethan realized he didn't know. He'd been so focused on just getting through each day, on being stable for her, that he hadn't thought about happiness in a long time. But maybe it would be good to use his mind again, to solve problems, to build things that mattered. He accepted the position. The transition was strange. Suddenly he was working in an office, attending management meetings, being consulted on decisions that affected the whole facility. His former co-workers on production floor didn't treat him differently, which he appreciated, but there was definitely a shift. Walter was happy for him, said he'd known Ethan was too smart to be tightening bolts forever, though he'd miss their lunch conversations. Ethan promised they'd still have lunch, and they did, at least once a week, because Walter had become a real friend and Ethan didn't have so many of those that he could afford to lose one. In his new role, Ethan started identifying and fixing the kind of systemic issues that had led to the hydraulic valve problem. He redesigned workflows, updated safety protocols, and implemented training programs. He pushed for better equipment and proper maintenance schedules. He advocated for the production floor workers in management meetings because he'd been one of them and he knew what they dealt with. Some of the other managers resented him at first. This guy who'd appeared out of nowhere and was suddenly making them rethink how they'd always done things. But the results spoke for themselves. Productivity went up, accidents went down, and employee satisfaction improved significantly within 6 months. Olivia noticed a change in her father. He seemed lighter somehow, more engaged, like a part of him that had been sleeping had woken up. He'd help her with her math homework and get excited explaining concepts, drawing diagrams at the kitchen table, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. He started tinkering with projects in their garage again, little engineering challenges, sometimes building things with Olivia, teaching her how circuits worked or how to use tools safely. The grief over Rebecca was still there. It would always be there, but it didn't seem to weigh on him quite as heavily. He was moving forward instead of just surviving. About a year after everything happened, Ethan was at Olivia's school for a science fair. She'd built a working model of a water filtration system with his help, though she'd done most of the actual work herself and could explain every part of it. Ethan was standing there watching her talk to the judges, feeling proud in that overwhelming way parents do when someone approached him. It was one of the other parents, a woman he'd seen around but never really talked to, and she said she'd heard about what happened at his work, about how he'd saved people. Ethan felt awkward and said it wasn't that dramatic. He just noticed something that needed fixing. The woman smiled and said that's exactly what a hero would say, and Ethan laughed and changed the subject. But later, driving home with Olivia chattering in the backseat about whether she'd win a ribbon, Ethan thought about that word. Hero. He'd never felt like one, not during any of this. He'd just been trying to do the right thing, to be a good father, to make it through each day with his integrity intact. Maybe that's what it came down to, though. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, but small choices consistently made to care about people and do what's right even when it's hard or inconvenient or comes at personal cost. Veronica's story didn't end well, at least not professionally. Word got around in their industry about why she'd been let go, and the job market for managers with her reputation was tough. Ethan heard through the grapevine that she'd moved to a different state, taken a position at a smaller company. He hoped she'd learned something from what happened, that maybe losing everything had given her perspective, but he didn't know and he didn't dwell on it. His focus was forward, on Olivia, on his work, on building a life that mattered. Harold Brennan retired about 18 months after bringing Ethan into the engineering department, and he told Ethan privately that one of his proudest decisions in his final years running the company was recognizing Ethan's potential and creating a space for him to use it. Harold said that companies were just collections of people, and if you couldn't see the value in people, if you couldn't look past surface judgments and really pay attention, you'd miss the best things they had to offer. He said Veronica had been a lesson for him, too, that he should have been more involved, should have questioned the culture she was creating, and he was glad that at least some good had come from the situation. Ethan stayed at Riverside. He'd get offers periodically from bigger companies, aerospace firms that wanted him back, tech companies that had heard about his work, but he'd turned them down. He'd built something here, a role that let him make a difference and still be the father Olivia needed. She was growing up, getting older, and he knew these years were precious and finite. Someday she wouldn't need him as much, and then maybe he'd think about other opportunities. But for now, this was where he belonged. The production floor workers at Riverside had a saying that developed after everything that happened. When someone would suggest an idea or notice a problem and feel like they couldn't speak up because they were just hourly workers or their position wasn't important enough, someone else would bring up Ethan. Remember Ethan? They'd say, remember the quiet guy in the worn jeans who saved everyone's lives because he paid attention and spoke up even when it was hard. Don't assume you don't matter. Don't assume people won't listen. You might be surprised what you're capable of if you try. And Ethan, whenever he'd overhear something like that, would feel uncomfortable with being the example, but also quietly pleased that maybe his experience had given other people permission to use their voices, to trust their observations, to believe they had value regardless of their job title. That seemed like a legacy worth having, better than any patent or professional achievement. The idea that he'd helped shift a culture towards seeing people more clearly and treating them with more respect. Years later, when Olivia was in high school and doing a project on everyday heroes, she interviewed her father. She asked him about that day when he'd shut down the hydraulic system, whether he'd been scared of losing his job or the consequences. Ethan thought about it and said yes. He'd been scared, but he'd been more scared of someone getting hurt, of living with that on his conscience, of teaching her through his inaction that protecting yourself was more important than protecting others. He said sometimes the right choice is also the hard choice, and you don't get to be a good person only when it's convenient. Olivia asked what he'd learned from the whole experience, and Ethan said that he'd learned people will always make assumptions about you based on surface judgments, on what you're wearing or what your job title is or how you present yourself. And you can't control that, can't stop people from underestimating you or dismissing you. But what you can control is whether you let those judgments define you, whether you shrink yourself to fit their limited expectations, or whether you show up as your full self, with all your capabilities and knowledge and dignity, regardless of whether anyone notices or appreciates it. He said Veronica had seen a floor worker in worn clothes and decided that's all he was, all he could be, and she'd almost caused a tragedy because of that blindness. But that was a failure, not his, and he tried not to let her limitations become his. Olivia said she was proud of him, and Ethan had to look away for a moment because the emotion of it hit him unexpectedly. He told her he was proud of her too, proud of the thoughtful, kind person she was becoming, and that everything he'd done, every choice he'd made since her mother died, had been about trying to be someone she could be proud of. Not perfect, because nobody's perfect, but someone who tried to do right by people, who showed up, who cared. He hoped that was enough. In the end, the story of the arrogant manager and the quiet single dad became one of those tales that gets told and retold, details shifting slightly each time, but the core remaining the same. It became a reminder that you can't judge a person's worth by their appearance or their position, that quiet people may be carrying entire worlds of knowledge and experience you know nothing about, and that treating people with dignity and respect isn't just morally right. It's practically smart because you never know who might be able to help you, save you, teach you something essential if only you'd bother to actually see them. Ethan never sought recognition for what he did, never wanted to be anyone's hero or inspiration. He just wanted to do his work, raise his daughter, and live with integrity. But sometimes the people who are most reluctant to stand in the spotlight are exactly the ones whose stories need to be told, because they remind the rest of us what really matters, what it means to be good and brave and humble all at once. They remind us to look closer, judge less, and appreciate the quiet strength that exists all around us if we're willing to see it.